I am inspired in the work I do. One, I'd say I'm motivated by my faith for the things that I do, but inspiration comes from the organizations and individuals that I see each and every day working for the common good. Our vision at the Trust, the team of flourishing for the common good. And so when we think about that work, each time I go on a site visit or we're reading a written review or proposal, you see individuals who wake up each and every day with a mission and an interest to make the world better, to invest their lives in the lives of other individuals, because they have a firm belief that the world can be better, that people can be better, and that is extremely inspirational to me.
The trust began in 1975, started by Jack Murdock, not Rupert Murdoch. Sometimes I maybe get asked that question all the time, who is the founder of the Tectonics Corporation. And the story about him I love is how even while he was a pretty big shot executive, he still went to a few old customers' houses and fixed their radios back then. He died very young, left a bequest of $91 million without a lot of instruction. And today, after already giving $1.4 billion in grants, the assets of the foundation stand at almost $2 billion with no additional influx of capital, purely from its investments over that time. So, as stewards of that incredible story and the assets that it produced, what are some of the things that you believe have been the most impactful over that time and that you're most proud of that the Murdock Trust has engaged in?
Wow, well, that would, as it relates to individual grantees, that would be difficult. It's sort of like naming your favorite child. But as it relates to the kinds of work that we have informed, I would say at the organizational level, and I'll break it up, at the level of the organization, at the level of kind of our impact in sectors, and then maybe talk a little bit about broader society. So at the level of the organization, for philanthropy, one of the things we always have to determine is how we prioritize and value resources. One of the things I'm most proud of at the Trust is that we have kept donor intent evergreen. We know a lot of things about Jack. And one of the things that we know is that he was innovative. Almost 250 to 300 companies came out of the Murdock Trust. And Jack cared deeply about people, and he cared deeply about issues across a broad range of things. And we have managed to keep the heart and the values of that donor intent fresh, rich, and responsive to the times. And then at the sectoral level, we were one of the very early supporters of scientific research. And recently we just had one of our researchers whose work we supported was given the Nobel Prize. So that's a pretty significant one, sitting on the campus of this particular university looking at an instrument that we helped to invest in that fundamentally helped us in our fight against COVID and other things is phenomenal. Simultaneously, I love the fact that we can support major scientific research, and also I can see an organization like a children's museum in one of our states, which is one of the best in the country. When one of the folks who works there is the leader, she was one of the first employees and has grown it from one employee to several hundred, and it's one of the best in the country. And so we see a broad spectrum of impact from leaders. I'm proud that we persist, and I'm also proud that we're committed to leaders in their work. And finally, I'm very proud of the fact that we believe in the power of what we can all do together, and that we support leaders who have very different opinions coming together to solve their problems and find solutions.
You're just coming off of a gathering of 300 of your partners who are faith-based leaders. What were they talking about?
They were talking about the future. So, and I'm talking to them, I'm talking to you, and I can't help but talk to the audience, those folks online. I'm like, who are you talking to? I'm talking to all these folks out here, too. We just had 300 leaders with us talking about the future of technology, the future of leadership, the future of what economic mobility looks like, and how do we help those who are struggling to find their place and way invocation to land in ways that they are not only supportive of themselves, but generative in society. And if you've been in any conversations these past few days with philanthropy, we talk a lot about the landscape and what is happening right now in our country and the impact that that's having on the social sector and what it means to lead in these very difficult times. We try to hold what we would call a safe tension between allowing people who come together with very different points of views to have a safe place to have conversations that's difficult sometimes to have in other public forums.
I'd like to continue on a few of the threads you just brought to us, and Amir, please jump in with us. Leadership. Tell us about, especially in these times, how the experiences you've had in the nonprofit sector and the for-profit sector, philanthropy, have adjusted your leadership style, have helped to make you the kind of leader you are, and help you evolve as time has gone by, as the situation has changed.
Yeah, well, I'll set a little bit of context. I worked for World Vision for 20 years, and for 18 of those under the leadership of Rich Stearns. And I came to Microsoft when I worked there shortly after Satya had become CEO. And for a brief period before I was at the Trust, I worked at the Trust. During the time when I was at World Vision, I watched how the organization became a leader on two big topics that were what you might call some of the intractable challenges we face in sectors. The first was the issue of the HIV and AIDS crisis, when we were seeing a lot of the work, sustainable work that had been happening over many years, being challenged in the field around the world because of what was happening with the HIV and AIDS crisis. One of the things that our leadership at that time recognized was that people of faith were not mobilized to actively act in that. And I got to watch Rich do the work of, alongside many others, turning the heart of the American church towards that issue, and also becoming one of the largest charities around clean water. So one issue that was very much a faith issue, and another one that was very much a secular issue. And then when I was at Microsoft, after Satya came to lead, if you know anything about the landscape of Microsoft, at the time that Satya came to lead, part of the big thing he did was change the corporate culture around an empowerment for everyone vision and a way of working. And it was absolutely phenomenal for what it did in the market, but also for what it did for the company. And here are the big things that I've taken away from being able to sit in those leadership environments. And then I'll add something after that. Is one, leadership in challenging times is always rooted in values. That values-based leadership is extremely important. And that values-based leadership in difficult times means being willing to take risks, to say things that we all know are true, but that we don't all feel safe to say and to do. That is rallying people around that, connecting their passion to your purpose, and that finally is about innovation. And it is about not just third way thinking or out of the box thinking, but you have to frame new boxes for people to live in, which means you have to lead with both vision and practicality. And I feel like those were lessons that were learned watching them play themselves out in very different but similar environments. So
You often use the term partner rather than grantee, which other foundations might use. Why is that?
Because we see it as a great gift and privilege to be able to do our work of funding and coming alongside organizations in support of their mission, and it's very much a partnership. They enable us to fulfill our mission by doing good work, and so at that level we see it as a partnership. And we believe that funding is only one way that you work with organizations. If you meet a grantee from the Murdock Trust, what I hope that they would stay outside of their joy of having got a grant from us is that they felt like we partnered along the way, that our process wasn't one that was about inspection, but it was one that was about inquiry and conscious learning, that we asked the questions that made their projects better, and that in that way we partnered with them, and that also we sought to learn from them in order to improve our work in the sector. And so the last thing I'll say about that is many of our initiatives come from having listened to the sector. So our proactive one we hope that in sectors like scientific research, we do a commercialization initiative, that emerged from listening to those that we funded, and that in that way they partnered with us to help us be proactive in the work that we do.
I just want to ask a question about leadership, going back to the fact that you work with two visionary leaders, one in the nonprofit sector at Whole Vision and then at Microsoft. Often we see the attitude expressed in the media and other places that there's a huge gulf between the private and the nonprofit sector. Styles of leadership are different, and sometimes board members from the private sector wish that the nonprofit sector worked more like the private sector, and there's all kinds of tensions around there. But you seem to have reconciled those two experiences as you take on your current leadership role. Tell us about your sense of how we should think about the differences between those two sectors and what you witness in terms of leadership there.
Yeah, I think the social sector is dynamically transforming. So I would argue that it is less a difference of sort of status, social sector or for-profit, in size and scale. Because the NFL was a nonprofit at some point. And I think it then transitioned. So I tend to think that the differences as it relates to operations, whether you're an enterprise or a small business, are actually related to the size and the scale of the institution and how it works. And we do a fair number of grants on any given day. And when you look at the operations of institutions, whether you have good people and culture policies, whether or not your technology systems work for individuals, that operational level typically has more to do with how large you are and how much how large your budget is or how big your P&L is. When it comes to the intentions of the organizations and impact, what I find is great organizations, whether they are for-profit or their social sector, they're driven actually by their mission and their values and how they connect that to the purpose. But the motivations are quite different. I would go, a profit motive, returning profit back to shareholders is very different than wanting to empower everyone through education and ensure that all children in rural counties have access to technology. And so I think the obstacles that are faced in achievement of the mission are very different, and the bottom line of how we define success are different. But what I have seen universally, whether it's a small business, I come from a family of small business owners, or a small nonprofit, needing to lead people with vision towards a mission with purpose with accountable outcomes exists across everyone who does business, whether the profit is social or the profit is financial. And good leaders do that well in their context. So,
to Diane's point about your professional partnership, are there areas of partnership between the for-profit and nonprofit sector that we should be pursuing more vigorously? Are there opportunities we're missing there?
So the U.S. is an interesting animal in the world landscape. As it relates to how we solve our challenges, we have divvied up that responsibility. So my spouse is Norwegian. And in his country, Norway, they have decided this is how we deal with our social challenges. In the U.S., we place some of that in the hands of education, we place some of it in the hands of nonprofits, we place some of it in the hands of government, which means that almost any intractable challenge, because of how we have divided that responsibility and to a certain extent argue about that responsibility, requires cross-sector collaboration. There is not a single entity, the government or the social sector, that is responsible for the challenges we face, which means in almost every sector of society, you need public-private partnership if you're going to solve intractable challenges. To meet needs, you don't have to partner, but to solve intractable challenges, you need partnership at almost every level to do that. To end homelessness, to ensure agency and outcomes for individuals who need to find vocational pathways to economic solvency and mobility. There's not a problem you can name where there's not a tri-sector solution that's necessary to solve it in the U.S. context. So I'm convicted and committed to that.
So going back to your 300 person gathering. Could you go a little deeper on some of the issues that they were being concerned with?
Sure. So leadership, we talked a lot about the challenges that leaders have to lead, and what transformative leadership is versus declarative leadership would be a way to talk about that. In the environment, we're going to just step back and give a little bit of context, but in the environment we're in, studies on change would say, my grandparents, even my parents, came up in a world where the level of change we would be expected to anticipate. You can start in a job and finish in the same company and career that you started in. Today, there was a study done 5 years ago by a number of economists, and they said in 10 years we're experiencing what would have taken 100 years of change. And there was an anticipation that we could get to a point where within 5 years or a year, you could expect the equivalency of what 100 years of change might have looked like technologically and in terms of advancement. In that kind of environment, the most resilient thing that leaders need to know how to manage is adaptive change. And so we talked a lot about leadership at that level and what adaptive change takes to have happen. And then we talked about the future landscape of artificial intelligence and the fact that for faith-based institutions, because these were 300 faith leaders, how AI has been something that folks are sort of pushing back from because there's been a lot of fear driving a sense of challenge. And we talked about the opportunities and possibilities and what can happen and why we need more folks of faith who are involved in shaping what will be the imagination. I'll say something that might be telling folks who know a lot about artificial intelligence what you already know, but oftentimes the models that we're talking about, whatever their deficiencies are or the great opportunities in them is based on who has programmed them. Well, if people of faith abdicate from the space of the creation and training of models, we create a void in that space for the things that we value, which means in as much as we have to be cautious about what's happening with artificial intelligence, we also have to be proactive and involved in shaping what is happening with the technology. Because it does not shape itself, it is shaped by the humans who coded and created and all of those things. And so we talked about how we think about the ethical considerations for that, and then we talked about some of the ways that you can utilize it to actually advance human work. When I worked at Microsoft, I did this talk called "The Robots Are Coming," and the fundamental premise of it was that I hope for the things that humans should not be doing, the robots do come, so that we can free up human ingenuity and expertise for things that only humans can do. Those were just a couple of the things that we leaned into. So.
Many faith organizations, I'm sure many you work with, I know many you work with, are deeply involved with issues like homelessness and housing, helping immigrants settle into the United States and gain skills here, gain employment, and all sorts of humanitarian work around the world and all. And some of these issues are front and center right now in potential change and change that's already happening. What did you advise your organizations how to respond?
Yeah, we've taken a three kind of prong approach. And so I think generally we would advise that I'd say we did a lot of listening. So probably the first place we start is hearing, and any advice that we give can only come after we have listened well. And we're still in the process of listening, to be honest, but I'll say the things that as we're in conversations we're talking about. One, the landscape of change is very fresh. So the first thing that we're advising is there's the short-term response, and then there is the long-term look of what is actually going to stick and be the changes that last. Leaders can spend a lot of time utilizing energy towards problems that won't persist. And so in part, we're advising, make sure we're getting the facts on the table, understanding what is really happening in the landscape, and responding to the issues that will be long-term. So the identification of concerns, the assessment of them becomes extremely important. So that's the first thing that we've been doing. The second is we have been talking to our partners across the board about what strategies they're taking so that we can be more collaborative in this season. to think about what walls do we need to be on together in order to affect change, and what things do we need to be doing separately. At a very practical level, we have seen just net difficult impact on organizations we serve. For some, hundreds, if not for others, thousands of people who have been laid off. We've seen aid projects that are on hold. And we've been thinking a lot about not just what we can do to respond to the changes that are happening at the legislative level, but given we're in philanthropy and we're distinctly focused on generosity, how do we enable greater generosity? Because we believe there's a role for government in attending to society and needs, but we also believe deeply in the role of faith and faith institutions. And we're asking the question, how do we not just respond, but how do we proactively lead in being more generous? And I'll just give one example. If you know anything about philanthropy and its requirements, there's essentially a 5% requirement for what you give. Well, last year, I think we gave just over 7%. Because we made every grant individual at a time. And so at a time when people are saying maybe philanthropy should give more, I'm grateful that our trustees were able to make the decision that we're already giving more, and that is always within the discretion, and it's always an option, not just at a time when government funding might be retracting. But I think we want to think about how not only are we generous, but how do we help to expand generosity in the face of some really stark reductions in funding in places where we are long invested. But we want to understand the landscape before we move to a significant amount of action, which could be energy that would not be well spent.
You've got a reputation around social justice issues and around equality, equity for all people, everybody being able to reach their potential in society. What are you thinking now about some of the pushback around DEI initiatives and pronouncements in universities and nonprofits and organizations that receive federal funding?
Yeah, I think we focus on outcomes. I think we believe in a merit-based environment. And I think we believe that diversity is good for us. It's good for us in every in every way, not just in some ways. And I think we recognize that there are those who don't have the same outcomes as others, right? We don't tend to be in the war of words. So I'll just declare kind of thing. We're not in the war around the language of what do we call it and how do we do it, right? I mean, because so much of it right now feels like we're arguing about the language that we use over and against the underlying principles. Like, we believe that human dignity is worth preserving. We believe that every individual should have the right to have agency and the opportunity to live out their full potential and value. And we believe that there's a shared responsibility between the individual and society to help to make that happen. And we acknowledge that there are people groups who have not had the same opportunities to do that. Where it gets sticky is, what's the policy that we put in place to do that work? And I would say, I don't know that the right levels of conversations between people who are really smart on these issues are happening. And so I'll take this moment to maybe encourage and say to those who are listening something I think we all have to start expecting, which is we want our policymakers to be having good conversations about the policies that enable the most number of people to live into this dream that we have for what it means to be a citizen and a stranger and an immigrant and a refugee in this country, to find the highest common denominator solution. And we can't let the war of the words stop us from going, we only rise as we all rise. I like to say I'm an Adam Smith capitalist, in that I believe in the wealth of nations and the theory of moral sentiments, which spoke to the fact that how we care for one another affects how strong we are as a nation and as a country. And I think our conversation on the topic, you either want to know what people are for or against, and we're just choosing to go, that's new box. We're not going to be for or against any of these things or put in any of those boxes. We're going to recognize when people are having differentiated outcomes. We're going to stand for the fact that we're better together and that we need to ask good questions about these topics and help people when they're not meeting outcomes, and that we need to believe in a society that benefits all of its members. And then we need to do the tough work. We need to roll up our sleeves and not have conversations about the words. We need to have conversations about the actual policies and how they're helping individuals across a lot of different types of difference achieve the kinds of results we want. And we talk about being human at work. I mean, we're doing so much talk here, it feels like we're losing the conversation around our humanity and our individuality and the places where we have so much shared value for things that I think we would all care about if we weren't caught in the polarizing constraints of frameworks that aren't serving us anymore. And so we need new language and new ways to talk about
I
it.
think the private sector figured out a long time ago that diversity is good business. I think about
Absolutely.
walking in to the building where I worked for 25 years in a bank. And if you went up to the teller line, if you stood and waited, there was one teller who had a tag on that said, "Hi, my name is Roberto, I speak Tagalog," and another one that said, "My name is Maya, and I speak Yupik," and "My name is Jose, and I speak Spanish." Why? Because the community is multicultural, and they want everybody's business.
Yeah.
Well, that's the way to get it. Amir?
Yeah, so I think your inspiring views on the power of generosity resonate well with the audience from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. But sometimes when you engage in policy conversations, people are skeptical that you can rely on generosity, that it's reliable, that it is as reliable as coercive mechanisms that provide incentives, either material or punitive, to get people to do certain things. And yet there is a generative quality to generosity and generosity communities that you're trying to build. So how do you convince people not to be so skeptical that generosity is not reliable, that it is kind of a small area that when push comes to shove, you really need the money or the coercion to get things done?
To simply look at history. So if you think about some of the hardest times, I mean, I know we're all kind of creatures of the present in our own circumstance, but when you're a student of history, what you recognize is that generosity of spirit is one of the only things that's actually typically brought us through. When you think about most of what we all exist in the philanthropic space, it has been made possible by the generosity of faithful people over time. What we know as the foundation of American philanthropy came from not only faith motivations, but faith motivations to be generous. You think about some of the most difficult challenges we faced, whether you think about civil rights movement or other things. That was based on not just generosity of cash, but generosity of spirit, of time, and of talent. And so I would say history proves that generosity can win out and is often the thing that is the seedbed of what turns societies and people groups, particularly when times are tough. And certainly our own self-interest is what is always at war with generosity. But the question you might ask is, have we been more generous historically than not? And I would say much of what makes us who we are has been because of a generosity of spirit and a story we may just not tell enough because we don't see it as, the thing that is sexy for the kinds of stories that we tell. But I think it's what makes us work. And kind of to your point, Diane, there's more cooperation, which at its basis is generosity of spirit happening in the world than there is antagonism at all times. I mean, if you drive outside of the person who randomly ranted at you, to drive in any place takes more cooperation than, and I don't say that like to be trivial, but I say it to say oftentimes we don't think of what is at the root of what it means to be generous, to give each other space. And I think we have to retell the story that in a season when we're being told that generosity is winning every single day, and that just shortly, we saw record generosity in the midst of the pandemic, right, from a fiscal perspective, but think of how much more that was at a communal level. So I think in part it's about telling a different story and then demonstrating a different reality in what we do. So,
Yeah, so I think there is a lot of embedded generosity without which our everyday lives would be very different, right? So,
indeed.
Yeah,
And if you've been in an ungenerous environment, you would see it more clearly, right?
so storytelling, you have a lot of, you think that can help change and engage more people to be more generous. Are there any other, I know you're still listening, but are there any other mechanisms that you think can engender, uplift, promote generosity to have it more present and more generative around us?
Well, I'll just say things that I see that are happening. So we work with a number of groups who are bringing people together who think very differently to create generosity of spirit around the problems that we face. And there are actual competencies and skill sets that it takes to do that, right? And so I think greater investment in those pluralistic practices and institutions who are helping people to build those skills, right? It amazes me that in this time someone would need to write a book on how to know a person, but clearly people need it because it's a bestseller, right? And there are folks who are helping people know how to know people and people who think very differently than they do. So that's one thing that's happening. As it relates to challenges that are facing, and I want to make sure I restate your question because I've got a comment Diane made and your question in my head. Yours is, what practices do I see that are helping to promote generosity?
Yes.
The other is, we've got a number of institutions that we support who take people through journeys of generosity, helping them think about their faith. And with this great transition of wealth that's about to happen, there's a number of organizations that exist to help people think about their giving in their life. And then I would say local churches provide the means, method, and motivation for people to be generous. And I know many leaders who are working to build people who have a theological foundation and worldview for what generosity should look like, and generosity in a lot of broad ways. So for me, it's almost name something I don't know that is helping to invest. I don't see a dearth. I actually see a plethora of those things. Yeah.
It seems like what people read about or hear about are the big giant gifts by a few wealthy billionaires. And then when there are abuses, nonprofits or in philanthropy. I'm wondering, I was saying earlier, we're in a discussion, having worked in media before philanthropy, I know a lot of reporters, editors, and they tend to hide, I hate to say it, about friends and, well, just what gets said here in the Madam Walker Theater. That they're not particularly generous as individuals. A lot of it, I think, has to do with suspicion on whether the money will be used well, or even their own stories they've written about abuses, that kind of thing, but often hiding behind the need to feel that they're being impartial, and if they were to donate to something, it would be showing some kind of preference. Even some people don't vote because they want to be pure, not seem to have a preference. So, but it seems as if the media in general could play a stronger role than it does now in getting to what you're talking about, stories of generosity that are not tied to a giant gift and that are more typical of what goes on every day in the United States and around the world.
Yeah, I think media could play a part, and I think there's also the stories we tell ourselves. I think the reduction in local journalism has an impact on it. Like, I think I was in a environment where they were doing some research around media, and they were talking about the reduction in local journalism and the retraction we're seeing there. And they were saying there was a time when people most cared about the things that were happening in their backyard. And now there's this great explosion of interest in what's happening on the national landscape, when 80% of people's lives is what's happening with their neighbors and next door. And they were talking about the fact that we need new stories and new local stories. And I think media plays a significant part of that. But I also think it's the story we tell ourselves. Think about the last 10 conversations you were in. How many of them were dominated by something that's in what I would say your circle of care? Like, how many conversations have you been in talking about something happening in DC when you can only give 10% of your life or time? You could call your legislator, you're potentially not in DC doing X, Y, or Z. And I raise that to say, I've been trying to think about how do I take back my storytelling time for myself? What I'm talking to my neighbors and my friends about, what I'm talking to community members about, what I'm talking about at church. We've got something we can take 10% of the impact on, that becomes 80% of our conversations and our own storytelling. And it says something about what's important. And so, I've been thinking about that very clear circle of control, circle of influence, and circle of care, and asking myself, is my time and energy dedicated proportionately in those spaces? And then thinking about our organization and saying, is our time and our own storytelling and conversation and how we're mobilizing our action appropriately affected in those spaces? Because I think everything we're learning about journalism says it's taking 80 to 90% of our circle of care, and that's what we're ingesting every single day, which I think has a net effect of causing people to feel disempowered about something they really can affect. Talking to their neighbor about how they feel about certain things, and building more grassroots and community level perspectives on the change we can affect for ourselves. And I think when it comes to faith and giving, that's where the church has been so good historically, is being proximate to pain in the midst of challenge. And that has been our generosity story. It shaped our theology, and it shaped our values conversation. And it is what has kept people who think so very differently about things coming together in a room, because their proximity to the pain has made it worth it to work together to build a values base and a theology that mobilizes people on behalf of those who are vulnerable. So, yeah.
We were struck by something that you wrote, that there are reasons for us all to care about the flourishing of faith-based nonprofits, whether we are religiously motivated or not. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research that's now coming out, or at least relatively a lot compared to maybe what there was, that speaks to the fact that civic engagement is on the decline. Most of you who are here who are tracking this know that the Department of Health released a report that, isolation is becoming a civic crisis. People feeling for lots of reasons, that fear, anxiety, and cynicism are causing people to retract. And there was a great article written that was talking about the fact that the decline in what people would say is a decline in congregational and faithful participation in worship of all types is tied to our decline in civic engagement. Because what faith communities do is they give people means, method, and motivation to do well, to get connected, and at their best to be outside of themselves. For most of American history, they're not sort of just social places where people come together to be with the people that they know, but they've been places where people come together to be activated to serve, and that creates engagement with the stranger, the neighbor, people who are other than. And so for that reason and many, I think people should be concerned about the decline of the church. And not that there are not, places where those negative criticisms are true, but by and large, the large majority of people who are faithful are not faithful for membership in a social club. They're faithful for a belief in something far more profound than themselves. And they want that to shape the way they show up in the world and show up for others. So.
Amir Pasic, did you want to invite our audience?
I was going to say, I have lots more questions too, but I think it's an opportunity for the rest of you to have questions. We have some microphones there, so just raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question. And while you're thinking, I'll ask a very operational question, kind of a standard question we often ask leaders I think we got a sense of some of the possibilities and successes of what happens when you have thoughtful engagement with open partnerships with the grantee. Can you give us some examples of endeavors either at your current job or elsewhere that haven't been so successful from which you have learned?
Sure. So when I first started at Microsoft, we were working on a project related to the future skilling and what future skilling needed to look like to deal with the impending technical cliff in a number of things. And in that, we were thinking about how do you really focus on the future of work and learning, and we had a pilot program that we were running to do that. And, you know, in a classic sense of being able to fail forward, we learned as much from that about what it takes to help a student get from the realization that they're technical to fully skilled to employed. There were a number of things that were extremely significant learnings. And then there were a number of things where you realize, wow, to fully engineer that system, back to your conversation, in each local context and labor market requires a different kind of collaboration between education, between labor, between industry, between the civic community in order for an individual student to be successful. And so while a Future Skills initiative was birthed from that, we learned a lot about the challenges of what you cannot engineer from an industry perspective and what has to come from a much broader collaboration of civil society. So that's one example of something where we learned a lot about how to partner with higher ed. We learned a lot about how to get students mobilized and skilled. And we also learned a lot about what collaboration would be needed, and in some places where it was more effective, and other places where it was less. So,
A lot of us think about faith as one thing, science over here, and your organization does a lot in both areas, scientific research, faith work. How do you reconcile the two?
probably because we start with a perspective of human flourishing as being about wholeness and not being, we can be very siloed in our lives. I mean, anybody out there feel compartmentalized at work when you're not working for a faith-based organization. It can be very easy in places to show up and to check faith at the door, but we fundamentally believe that there's an importance in ways of knowing, that scientific inquiry and intuitive ways of knowing and seeking truth are important. That the pursuit of truth is important, and that humans are not sort of robots who are programmed to only do one of those things, and that we fundamentally think flourishing is when we can all show up in our own full humanity. So I think for us, it's almost like a fish being in water. It's so intuitive to us that those things are connected and that they are important parts of how we solve the significant challenges we face. And that if you were to think about most of what we consider major scientists today who have shaped us, they were also people of faith, and faith was a part of their scientific inquiry and journey. So we don't see them as opposed at all. In fact, we see them as a part of an orientation to how we both know and understand the world, how we solve problems, and ultimately how we are known to one another, and invite that knowing. The last thing I'll say is I think when you believe in a diaspora in set of distinct ways that people know and come to know things, you believe a lot that we have ontological conviction and we need epistemological humility, and that the pursuit of truth requires that. We have to feel a sense of safety in the way we come to know the truths we know, and then we have to feel a level of conviction that we can go out and talk to other people, and that we will not only hear their truths, but that they will be willing to hear ours, and that that's the way as humans we make meaning together. And when we're constrained in that, we tend to make war with one another, whether that is ideological or political or actual war. And that there is something about a deep humility about what we know and hold true that is actually what helps us to solve some of the biggest challenges that we face.
You have such a wonderfully expansive and inclusive way of talking about faith. It's very broad and includes, I think, very broadly everybody. I think, right? It's not exclusive in any sense. But to your point about war, we see tanks rolling in Europe for the first time in 50 more years, and then faith used to bolster some of the rather inhumane policy. So how do we maintain this kind of broad, humanistic, open, loving notion of faith when we also know that faith can be used in less kind ways?
Yeah, it gets back to your question about how do we believe in generosity. I think one of the things is it's actually in the ways I think we've marginalized faith. I would say a part of the challenge that we see today is actually a challenge of formation, the isolation of faith. We've made, there are lots of, I'll give this example, and I haven't met a story I don't like, so you just have to hold me to getting to this. But when I worked at Microsoft, one of the things that was so interesting to me, and I'm not sort of like a Bible thumping sort of Christian person, like in the terms of I've got to tell people when I meet them the first thing, I'm a Christian. Not the way I'm oriented, but as a natural part of being a human who sees faith as just a part of who I am, I would share at work, and people would be like, it must be so hard to be a Christian there. And I was like, absolutely, it was not. I actually would have people come knock on my door. I can't believe you talked about your faith. And I say that to say, like generosity, I think faith, people have been taught to put faith under a bushel. And so those people who carry faith with humility are overshadowed by those people who carry faith with a big horn. And William Blake has a great quote, the vision of God that thou dost see is my vision's enemy, right? In the way we perceive our faith and who it calls us to be in the world, we have differences, and that's a part of being in a pluralistic society. I think the way we create a different social contract is by those who are the quiet observers of humble faith, being seen and visible. I think the reality is we're going to always have people with ideologies and worldviews who think very differently and use them in different ways. Faith is not a universal utopian thing. And I think that's the other thing that people have to see, right? Is that what my faith leads me to do and its practice and its outworking can be very different than someone else. And that means that faith formation is so important around generosity, around politics, around all of these things. And that faith cannot be separated from those things. Because I like to say we all worship something. What actually determines your faith is what you bow down to, what you get excited about, right? What you worship. And I think we have to talk a lot about faith formation and how people are being formed in faith. And the outworkings of all faith are not things that respect human dignities. Some people believe you need to break a few omelets to create the Christian, bake a few eggs to create the Christian omelet of the world that they want to see. And that's about your vision of who you believe Christ to be, or who you believe Muhammad to be, or who you believe whatever the prophet is that shapes, right, your faith. And we just need more places where that dialogue can happen. And I just don't know that we have had those, to be honest. So that's a long answer to, it's not a utopian panacea.
But it's a wonderful response. It's beautiful, and I think reminds us that any faith that bestows dignity on others is something we need to take seriously. Wonderfully wide-ranging conversation. This is your last chance, in person or online, to join us. I can see by the expressions that people are that there's attention here and people are paying attention. Okay, we have.
There's a question in the front.
Tasha, there's a question.
Oh, there's two.
Two questions, excellent. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I'm struggling to put this question together, but
Safe space.
The context of de Tocqueville and how philanthropy started a long time ago to where we have evolved, where it's evolved to today, and also the context of the court case that ruled and said that corporations could be people And we can spend all the money that we have in elections and political adversity. Have we evolved to a place where the American experiment has kind of fallen away or is ideally skewed beyond control? Again, forgive me for a weird question that's still formulating itself in my head.
No weird question. I think we all, and thank you for your willingness to be formative. I'm going to repeat back what I think I heard you say to then make sure I'm answering it. I think you were asking the question from the genesis of where we were when we think about what philanthropy is, where we are today, and the state of the country. Are we so askew from our fundamental principles? And maybe a part of that question is where are we going? The first thing I would say is if I knew the answers to that question, I would probably be somewhere else right now. So I don't know the answer, but I am willing to process out loud and to say a couple of things. And because I think as leaders, this isn't a part of this conversation. We have to start to say, I don't know, but will you give me space to process out loud so we can journey together in what we might be thinking to formulate a new reality. And here's what I would say in the American landscape as a student of sort of kind of world history and change. As a roughly, we're celebrating the quincentennial as a roughly young nation, we're kind of in puberty. Where we're at is actually not unexpected on the world landscape, and the fact that we're not all out with swords and other things right now is actually a good thing. When you look at the development of civilization and nations, the reality is that these kinds of ideological sort of friction points, they're not unexpected in the way nations develop, kind of thing. And so I find myself, depending on the administration and other things, having all kinds of questions as we all should. And I'm not saying what the temperature or nature of those things are, but I would say I don't think they're unexpected for a nation as young as ours to be going through some of these challenges, which for me says there's great hope that really the future still remains in our hands. But our has to be seen as all of us, that we all have agency in the everyday decisions that we make. Peter von Ranke is the father of modern history, and he observed something which speaks to where are we going. He said, we have this fundamental belief that everything just gets better. That's kind of how people think about it, and everything should get better. And he said, with technology, that's generally true. Anybody ever seen an iPhone commercial that says, hey, this iPhone is worse than the last one, it has less functionality. We tend to buy better technology. He said, we tend to think that that's true about people, and it's not. And he used an example of modern day anesthesia that back when it was first created, they were like, hey, there's this new thing. When people need surgery, we can put them to sleep. And most of the time they wake up. Whereas today, you would never imagine anesthesiology and not waking up. Well, if you look at human history, we have peaks and valleys. There are times in history that seem darker than other times in history. And that is about the collective conscience of individuals and how we choose to show up and stand, which gets to your comment, Diane, about leadership. And we're in a time where we're going to be is going to be about the quality of leadership that emerges. And in times like these, something that I would say is true is to stand for ideals when we're so polarized on both the left and the right. Leaders have to be willing to take the loss, to say, I don't know, I'm sorry, thank you, to retract the statement that was made in error because they were in a complex circumstance and said something that maybe wasn't right. People will have to risk their political careers to do the right thing when to say something other than whatever the predominant group's mind or thought is means you could not be a part of that group. And that's the challenge of leadership, and how much all of us do that at our kitchen tables, in our synagogues, in our mosques, in our churches, in our organizations. We build the muscle for the future. And so I think the future is still ours to write, but it is going to take all of us, if we're waiting on a small few to make the right decisions in order for that to happen, then I become more concerned. But as long as each of us show up each day in the places where we show up, and we encourage and mobilize others to show up for the fundamental things that we know to be true. None of us want to see people shamed, blamed, vilified. We all know that's wrong. We learned it on the playground. Then I have much more hope. So much more. I love your question. So much more that as individuals, I think we need to be talking about, and we need to be talking about how we feel. We talk a lot about how we think, but how many of us just sit down with people and go, I'm anxious, I'm frustrated, I'm mad today, so that we can connect in our humanity, not just in our logic. I think all those things are important, so, sorry.
Wonderful general question, and since we promised that last question goes to us.
Hi, thank you for a great conversation. You definitely touched on this, how the nonprofit sector is facing monumental disinvestment from the federal government, a primary source of funding for much of our sector. And you touched on how the Murdock Trust, is seeing the layoffs that are already occurring, is also responding to the moment in a way, increasing how much you're granting out from the 5% minimum. And I think there's certainly parallels to the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis nonprofits faced then. Of course, not from disinvestment, but from such a great need that resulted from the pandemic. And I think then and now we see similar calls from the nonprofit sector to our philanthropic organizations. Please invest in us more, provide sustainable sources of funding so we don't have to go into crisis mode every time one of these events take place. So I'm just curious, the conversations happening right now at the Murdock Trust or at other large philanthropic organizations that you're connected to, how do they differ from the conversations that were happening during the pandemic when it comes to this call that nonprofit organizations are asking of philanthropy?
Yeah, what I would say is I think it's actually interesting because people sort of cite the COVID period as a time where there was a lot of differing points of view on how to respond. And I would go relative to this, COVID was sort of a panacea of agreement, right? Because you had all sectors of society trying to figure out how do we beat this disease, right? How do we get back to stable footing? And so you saw some of the largest giving ever across every sector, right? The federal government, philanthropy, individuals, everybody put in more. So I would say what you see really differently now is you see the challenges of prioritization taking place. So what do I hear? I hear foundations talking about increasing payout. I hear philanthropic organizations talking about recoverable grants. I hear philanthropic organizations talking about expanding generosity by creating matching funds that, if we increase our payout, can we get the general public to match that in some ways? I see all of those things. I also hear on the other side of that, that philanthropy alone cannot meet the gap of disinvestment by the federal government, that the largest sources of giving are individuals, and that what does it mean to have more generosity? Also, what does it mean right now at this time for us to figure out the most efficient and effective ways to try to address the most intractable challenges? And what I would say is an opportunity I haven't heard yet, because right now people are still trying to understand what's happening, is will there be new ways that organizations will work? Will we see mergers and collaborative efforts, shared back offices? Like, will organizations figure out in the wake of what will unlikely be a deficit in funding because neither philanthropy or individual giving will catch up? Does that mean we have to have a drop in service, or could there be some out-of-the-box thinking about new ways of doing business that might help some organizations to work at scale in different ways? And I think we're going to need all of those solutions as we work through the sort of ultimate place of where we land in the renegotiation of the social contract of government under this new administration. So those are a few thoughts to what was a lovely question. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being part of this expansive conversation that delved into specific policy responses all the way to how faith basically constitutes the policy possibility. So let's conclude by allowing Diane and then Romanita to share any last thoughts they may have. They may decide to reflect on whatever they wish, of course, but perhaps they'd like to give some advice to our students who are hoping to perhaps end up in a position where they can be as influential and as inspiring as our two guests on the stage. So Diane.
I'm going to use my comment as another question, which is, there's a real issue, and I think our questioner's comment about the stress and the going crisis to crisis really plays into this. There's a clear human resource issue for the nonprofit sector, people really having that great desire to serve. I think people who come up in faith communities often get that. I know as a Jewish kid, I was always raising money for trees in Israel or candy for this or that. But how do we get young people to really re-engage in terms of generosity, or are we just not cool anymore?
Well, it's a great question. I'll try to see if I can connect any final thoughts to that. And I guess I'll end with maybe what's a more personal statement about what I believe is at the heart of the challenge that we're facing, which you talked about when you talked about being working to raise money for Candy or other things. I think we face a formative challenge in what we talk about, and I think the work of education, so thank you for what you all do to educate and build a generation of leaders in all the ways that faith communities and families form people are important. You asked me a first question, which what has inspired you? And I'll take a moment to be maybe personal and also emotional, because I don't think we do this enough in public commentary. My mom is my greatest inspiration. So I was born in the South in a very kind of a place that's been one of the poorest places and one of the poorest states in the country. And when we were growing up, if poor was a brand, I like to say I would have had the shoes, the socks, the headband, like the hat, like the jacket, all the paraphernalia of poverty. But I had no idea that we were poor, because we were raised with such dignity in our family. I found myself in many a place where, in the midst of challenging things, the question of ego or service could arise for me. And and not that I'm a person, ask my husband or my children, I've got an ego, so there's no perfection here. But I think in the times where I've been most proud of myself, what I remember about my mom is we did not have, but all I knew is that we gave. She's like my inspiration and has shaped my formative beliefs about what it means to serve. And I share that story because in as much as I've got to sit under great leaders of big corporations, it's the everyday ways we're formed by our interactions with one another that determine how we're going to show up on the landscape. And so while today, if you have the ear of the king as a person of faith, or the ear of the president, or the ear of a legislator, or the ear of someone in power, I hope the people who are stewarding their voices with those individuals are doing it well. But what most of us have as the general public, as people in philanthropy, are each other's ears and the way we tend to use that time. And 20 years ago, I wrote a mission statement. And you know how they have you do that exercise, and you're like, is that thing gonna stick? And it has stuck to me like gum on a shoe. And it was to know the Lord and to make the Lord known. And what that has come down to me in practice has been being in a space with people, going, what does it mean to love them and to love those I'm with right where I'm at? And I guess if I had an encouragement, it would be to invite us back into just loving one another and being human together and making courageous choices about what we all know to be right, to not be forced into boxes that don't fit with identities and ideologies that don't work, but to expect the best of our leaders, to expect them to show up for everybody, and to be willing to ask the question, if we have to sacrifice, how do we make choices that ensure that those sacrifices affect the least amount of people and are done in the most thoughtful ways? And we are going to have to make choices. We've always been making choices, and this administration is not the first to need to do that. So how do we do that in a more thoughtful way? And how do we each play our part in that? And so I like to say, love the work I do, but I love the people I do it with, and it's been lovely to do this work with you all today. Thank you for the gift of your time, to be here, to even take the time to listen and want to hear what I might have to share. I wish I had as much time to hear from each of you, because I know it would be as thoughtful as anything that I could say. So,
Thank you so much, Romanita. Thank you, Diane. Thank you all for joining us here in the audience at the Madame C.J. Walker Theater. Thank you for joining us online. Please join us at the end of April when we'll be welcoming the next guest in our series, will be Sam Gill from the Doris Duke Foundation. Thanks again, and have a safe travel home. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.